right, we are back on Play It Forward. Today's show, we got Harry Locke IV, filmmaker, writer, director, the Redeemer. Thank you for being on the show.
Thank you for having me. I appreciate it.
Harry, it's my pleasure. It's a gorgeous picture, a very strong thematic topic. Would you like to introduce yourself and or the movie in any way prior to asking the questions?
Sure, yeah. So as a writer director, I've kind of been involved in several different projects, probably over the past decade. And this project kind of came from a very interesting place. The lead actor, Robbie Allen, who plays the deputy marshal, in the project, his name Jackson is the name of the character. We had recently just came off doing a feature film together, and we had a very humbling learning experience in putting that together. It was my first big feature. We shot the film over in Hawaii. It was based on the script that we used on this action adventure. Kind of came to us as an opportunity to kind of really upgrade our chops and work on a bigger form project. And during the process of doing that movie, Robbie is a huge Lone Ranger fan, and he was constantly talking to me about how great the character is, and how the new Disney versions of the project hadn't really done it justice, because there's a whole lot of mythos and a whole lot of meat within the project to really dive into. And he was kind of picking my brain of how would we go about doing an update to it. And I didn't know a whole lot about the character, and I said, once we kind of wrap this project, I'll start taking a look into it. Maybe we can do a fun little thing together, like a fan film type thing. And I went and I got these graphic novels, and I was really getting into the history of the Lone Ranger. And I always wanted to do a Western. That was something. My favorite film of all time is Tombstone. I grew up loving the Western, and I was like, it'd be really cool to kind of do one, to really kind of dive into one, but it has to feel right. I don't want it to feel like a dated type Western. I want to kind of take some of these more contemporary angles to it, but not make it feel like it was too preachy or too heavy handed, in what we were doing. And one of the things that I've noticed when I was reading the graphic novels or the older Lone Ranger material, the one thing that always kind of bumped me was the character of Tonto, because you had this very interesting indigenous character, but he was always following along the Lone Ranger, and he didn't really have a reason to be there. I'm like, why is this guy just, willing to die for this character that he doesn't really have any stake in? And the first thing I was like, it'll be really interesting if we give that character, it its own, operation, its own agenda, its own storyline, its own reason to kind of be involved in the story. And that was kind of the first beginning of crafting Moon. I was like, okay, well, let's give the character his own reason to be there, but also, I kind of want to change things up. Maybe Tonto isn't this strong grunt male, but maybe it's a very complex, sophisticated female character who has lost everything and is hell bent on revenge. And there's a lot of things you can play with. I mean, we see revenge movies done so well, over the years, but also kind of bringing in that historical, indigenous aspect, to where this was a people that were a certain period of time were being hunted, were being prosecuted by, several different forces going on at the time. And so I kind of wanted to play in that historical context with it. And that was the creation of that character. And I liked where that was going. And then also I was like, well, in terms of the antagonist, how do we make an antagonist that's different, that breathes different on film, and especially in the Western, because we've seen so many classic villains. And I kind of perverted the Lone Ranger history, where I was like, well, what if he has a blood relationship to the villain? And now he's kind of got this divisive factor in him where he wants to be a lawman, but he's hunting his own blood as well. And so it's a complicated situation. And initially, I think I wrote it was going to be a brother. And I was like, yeah, but we've seen that so many times of, the two brothers duking out. Like, what if it's his sister, and she's got this more complicated thing where, she's trying to live in her father's shadow. There's obviously the complications of being a woman in that time, being taken seriously. And so she kind of needs to up her ante to become this vicious viper type character. And that was the birth of Branya. And so in the process of writing all this, I kind of realized, yeah, well, thank you. And in the process of writing all this, I realized, this was no longer a Lone Ranger film. This was like something completely different now. This had become its own piece, its own identity. And that we changed it from being a some Lone Ranger type title to being the Redeemer. And it took on a life of its own. And that became the process of us going into production and shooting it.
Now, you've outlined the general kind of factors that all came together, and this
Right.
like kind of one layer of how the films get made. And
Yeah.
then there's the
Yeah.
motivating layer, right? There's the layer
Right.
underneath. And that's really the first question to play it forward is, you know, generally I say, what was that germinal seed, that inspiration, that vision, the idea, whether it was a vision in your mind or a word or something that says, hey, I want to explore this. And for you,
Yeah.
since it is so heavy in good and evil, since it is so
Right.
heavy in this idea of redemption, and
Right.
even what is redemption and what do we need to redeem ourselves from? Um,
Right.
what is there in that, on that level, that motivated you
Yeah.
to, this is a project and this is the idea, and okay, let me go for it.
Right. So I think the biggest theme for me in that, and this is something that gets explored really, really heavily in the feature version that I've kind of written for it as well, is this whole notion of optics, and this whole thing of who decides who is a hero and who decides who is a villain, because it all depends on this lensing of who's looking at it. I mean, you look at just the way the country is now, we're very divided and nobody sees themselves as being the antagonists in their specific situation, right? Everybody can kind of justify why they've done or why they're doing X, Y, and Z. And one of the big things with the short and those characters between, the Marshall and Jackson, the Comanche and Moon, and the Outlaw and Branya, they all have their own justification as to why they are doing what they are doing. And it can be argued that in their own specific story, they are the hero. They what they are doing is justified in their view. And there's this whole idea of, depending on who you kind of align yourself with, you and I may disagree on something. I may think you're kind of the antagonistic force on a concept. You may think I'm the antagonistic force. And it's just in your mind, you're seeing what's the correct thing. And this whole idea of who gets to label that, who gets to decide who is that, who plays those roles, I think was a huge thing in playing with the short. And like I said, there's a feature version that has been written. The only reason why I bring that up is the big concept with that is that I actually based the feature story off of a an actual historical event that happened in 1885 Wyoming. So you still got the same characters that are in the short, but the subtext that plays in that one is I've learned of this insurrection that happened, real life insurrection that happened in Rock Springs, Wyoming, and basically at the time there was all these it was during the mining period. And so you had this small town called Rock Springs, where it was mostly either white miners and Chinese immigrant miners. And in the course of that history, what ended up happening is the railroad company that was owning the mines ended up hiring more and more and more Chinese miners. And the white miners felt like they were being replaced, that they were going to become considered obsolete. And so eventually they rebelled, and they banded together and they chased out the Chinese miners, and it led to this whole brutal conflict. And so that's the feature version uses that as a subtext with all these other fictional characters that I have in the short. And one of the big things that plays in that feature script is this idea of optics. On one hand, you could say, yes, the white miners were concerned about their livelihood. They had a legitimate concern that they were being run out of town, that they needed to do something, to band together. And, and in many of their words that comes from actual historical texts, even back in 1885, right, is we got to keep America American, right? And this is almost 100 plus years ago. But on the other hand, you have the Chinese miners. They were just trying to fend for their lives. They were just trying to feed their families. They were just trying to, better their own, position and do good things. And on both sides, there's this idea of optics where no one is seeing themselves as being the villain. They're just defending their own livelihood, and so there's this natural expansion where I saw where the short was going, and then I learned of this historical story with the with that I could put in the feature version of it, and I think that theme just became much stronger of not necessarily saying who's good or who's bad, but letting those lines blur
Yeah.
naturally
Yeah.
and playing within the gray zone of justifying these different characters and not making them just the classic mustache twirling villain or the riding on the white horse do-gooder, because that's how life is. It's messy, right? It's a very messy thing.
Do you think there's been something in your life experience that gravitated you towards that particular exploration?
I think it's a constant thing of just different experiences and conversations that I've had with people, where realizing that sometimes we may be talking about the same story, but it's like we both have completely different versions or different alignments of what happened. And there's no real scientific explanation as to why, but your own personal agendas and just how your own optics of how you see how those things have happened. Obviously I've had more of those conversations now, over the past, few years than ever before, just with how divisive things have become political, even just, conversations of obviously, the pandemic, happening and how different people were envisioning that. Some people saw it as a very serious thing. Some people thought it was a hoax. Some people thought it was not so serious, and in their mind in these conversations, it's like, okay, well, how do you navigate that field, and not necessarily say, okay, you're out of your mind, you're a villain, how do you
Yes,
make
of course.
that inclusive thing to trying to see where other people are coming from?
Yeah.
I think that's definitely, it's very much a sign of the time of, you know, people are more open now to expressing their different consenting opinions and why they feel the way they are. And I think the only way we're going to be able to move forward with any sort of good progressive evolvement from this is finding out how to be inclusive of all these different ideas and not letting things get so radicalized and letting so many, verbal fires, break
Right.
out from it. I
Right.
think it's a huge thing we should be looking at.
Right. And that's, when I think about the title of the film, The Redeemer, and what
Right.
are the rubrics that we gauge what is productive, progressive, and what's destructive?
Yeah.
And there are those
Right.
factors, and one of them certainly is inclusivity. And when there's a
Right.
perspective or an optic, as you're saying, that's coming from a place of inclusivity and wanting to embrace and
Yeah.
create a place, an environment for the whole that's considerate of the people or the populations that are
Yeah.
affected by whatever topic it is, and the ones that aren't considering that. So
Absolutely.
so
Absolutely. And I think, a funny thing about that word and, the way it kind of plays out in the context of the short, because I think there's even a conversation that Jackson has with Moon, where basically what Moon is trying to get is redemption for the loss of her family, and witnessing that. But what Jackson says is what you're looking for is revenge. And so there's this whole, even within the three characters, there's this whole dissension of where does the line for redemption stop? Where is it revenge? And where is it justice?
yeah,
Right. And I'm
yeah,
sure those three characters, if you were to take those three characters and put them on a panel, they probably would not have the same definition of redemption, between the three of them. They would all stand on different grounds,
well,
because Jack's,
I'm going to say I challenge that a little bit, just because at the end of the
yeah,
movie,
yeah,
you have them, two of the characters,
right,
Jackson and Moon, standing together
right,
at a gravesite, and she
right,
says something along the lines of, "There's no redemption in fighting,"
right,
you
right,
know. So that
right,
violence ultimately
right,
is a destructive force that doesn't lead
right.
us as humanity to a place of redemption.
Right, and I think they would probably agree on that regards, but I think they would probably still, I think in her idea, because he says that line to her of, "Where are you going?" And she says to find what she has lost. I think she's still in her mind, she knows now that violence isn't the answer, but if not violence, then what is the answer? What is something that is going to make her feel
Yeah.
whole?
Well,
And
that's
it's
a
this
great,
idea of still seeking, right?
yes.
That she needs to still seek out and learn, that because you get these movies where they wrap everything up in a bow. It's like, oh, the character learned everything, and
Yeah.
it's like, oh,
Yeah.
we're off to
Yeah.
the next thing. But I think it's more natural where you're kind of in these situations where it's a crisis situation. You're maybe not necessarily thinking with a level head. You're just kind of acting instinctually. And
Yeah.
as I think kind of the outcome of that, she learned the lesson that, yeah, like we killed this woman. I still don't feel completely
Yeah.
whole out of it.
Yeah.
What do I need to do to feel whole and to move on to that next chapter of my life? And I think that's kind of where she's at when she separates from him,
Yeah.
at the
It's
end.
beautiful. Yeah. And there's only one
Yeah.
place any of us can go is forgiveness.
Right. Right.
You know,
But
that's
we all take our own
time
journey and
getting
our
there.
own
Yeah.
timeline. Yeah,
Yeah.
timeline and getting
Yeah.
there.
For
Yeah,
sure.
yeah,
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 definitely.
yeah,
Moving on to the second question, play it forward, and we've
yeah,
really, definitely explored quite a bit of it already. But as a writer crafting a narrative, as a director
yeah.
shooting that narrative, and then as an audience member watching that narrative, you have
Right.
the greatest insight to the
Yeah.
thing that you're communicating. So,
Right.
um, risking the fear, of telling the
Yeah.
meaning of, analyzing your own movie, which, can be
Right.
scary for anybody to do.
Right.
But what do you think is the message for you? Doesn't have to be for anybody
Yeah.
else, for you of that movie in your life.
Hmm. Yeah. I mean, I think it kind of goes back to that. It kind of goes back to that optics thing of sometimes if you leave yourself open to change and you leave yourself open to conversation, you could find allies in some of the most unlikely places. You never know who's going to be there, and you see it kind of with, you know, Jackson ends up getting ambushed. You think he's going to die. You don't necessarily expect this Comanche warrioress to come in and pick him up. And what's interesting is, though they don't, in the kind of the midpoint of that movie, though they don't necessarily agree on what their next steps are, or what the end game is going to be. It's that dissension between the two of them that actually helps them both move forward.
Mm,
And I think what's interesting is to not necessarily shy away from conflict,
mm,
right? But
mm,
saying, okay,
mm,
how can these diverging or
mm.
converging ideas move us both forward and not just run us
Yeah,
up against the wall?
yeah,
Because
yeah.
they could have just said, "Oh, you want to do this, I want to do that."
Later.
We're
Right.
out, and they
Yeah,
both would have failed.
yeah,
Separated, they both
yeah,
would have failed.
yeah, yeah,
But together, by
yeah.
them hashing out, and obviously with a short, you need to try and keep the runtime down. I mean, I would have loved to, there's obviously probably a whole journey that happens between those two characters, after that scene on the hilltop where they are traveling together and they are looking for Brian, and they probably have more conversations, learn more history about the two of
Hmm.
them.
Hmm.
Um,
Hmm.
which is something that we couldn't, we shot this thing in a weekend, like a 3-day period
Yeah,
up
yeah,
in Sonora, California, which is about 40 minutes east of Yosemite. So we had a very tight schedule to get everything
yeah,
done. But
yeah.
that's something I definitely would have loved to explore, is just showing them traveling and sort of the conflict in philosophies, but how that actually bonds them
Mm,
and they
mm.
move forward
Yeah,
because of it.
yeah,
I think that's
yeah.
probably the biggest thing for me, is showing don't necessarily shy away from your opposition, because you can learn
Absolutely.
something, and sometimes your opposition makes you a better person, for that
Absolutely.
very reason.
Absolutely. And I think
Mhm.
it's so critical that you bring that out. It's not the dissenting opinions that are bad, it's a lack of
Right,
harmonizing and listening to those needs of those sides that
right,
creates suffering for all parties, you know. And
absolutely,
if our
absolutely,
goal is to evolve and minimize the suffering in this world, then we've got
yeah,
to hear one another out, and truly
absolutely,
come to a conversation where we don't have our the the idea that we are right, you know,
Right.
and that there's not another perspective that we can gain and harmonize and bring together and, you know, evolve.
Absolutely. Right.
Um, Last question, play it forward. Since making this movie, how have you changed as a person?
Wow, that's a great question. Um, I definitely it's interesting. I never really considered myself I consider myself more a director first, writer kind of second. And one of the big thing for me is working on this project, I really learned what makes a character pop off the page, how to actually give a piece of yourself into those characters to make them feel authentic. And it's something that I can see the transformation between me working on this project and the stuff before. Yeah. So I think, the biggest thing is just what makes a a character human, what makes a character pop off the page. And I think before, I was so consumed with plot and choreographing certain scenes and making sure the scene and spectacle was there. But and knowing thinking that, okay, no, I know characters are important and the storylines are important and giving the characters a genuine sense of character traits, a certain inherent wealth to them. But I don't think I really understood what it meant until I got to this project. And I this was probably the first project where I was, again, strictly playing off of a theme, this theme of this kind of optics and how each character had their own kind of modus operandi of what they were seeking. And seeing it how successful that was with the short, because I've gotten a lot of compliments of, how good the cinematography is and how good the sound and the editing and the technical things are. But I think this is probably like one of the first projects where I've done where they're really like, man, no, I really like the characters. I really like kind of the setup of what was going on, and also just seeing how the actors were able to easily latch on when you give them that much meat to play with. It makes it very easy. Your directing is basically done because you've already done it on the page. They can eat it up. They'll ask you certain questions about the background and things like that of certain characters, but just seeing how they are processing that as well, I thought was very interesting to see how, okay, the script must be doing its thing because they're getting the crux of the story and they're bringing their own kind of person. They're bringing their own motives and moves into it, which was really something cool to see. And again, going on and developing, the feature, I think that was the biggest thing for me where I was like, okay, I'm going to worry about character first. And I'm going to worry about, what is this saying? What is the story? What is the script saying to people when
Yeah,
they either read it or hopefully eventually watch it?
yeah.
What is kind of the mark of what is this putting out there into space? I knew that I wanted to create things that do talk to the contemporary sense, that kind of do talk to the zeitgeist of the times. But I always am trying to do it in a way that's not heavy handed or preachy. I see so many projects now where you watch it and you can really feel like they had their checkbox of like, okay, well, now we got this black character. Now we have the LGBTQ character. Now we have this character, and it doesn't feel authentic, right? And it really feels like, oh, you're trying to just hit me in the head with all these different things. And the biggest thing for me was, I love seeing the diverse aspect of film that's going on now, but how do we do those stories in such a way where it feels authentic? And I think coming out of this project for me was the biggest thing of saying, okay, no, I think I've got a handle on how I want to tell these stories in a diverse, inclusive manner and not make it feel like, oh, he just put that in there for the sake of the sake of just having it. Oh, the Branya is a female just because they wanted to have, a female outlaw. No, there's a legitimate reason why she is doing what she is doing. There's a legitimate reason why Moon is doing what she is doing. And I think when people watch it, no one has said, oh yeah, they just put women characters in this Western, just to help sell a diversity point. No, I think they feel like it's pretty authentic as to why those characters are there and why they're able to do what they're able to do in the sense of the story.
So that's beautiful, and what a huge transition to come to as an artist. And what I hear you saying is
Yeah.
basically you're
Yeah.
like, hey, as a writer, I have figured out the formula for
Yeah.
myself to put myself
Right.
into the character. So now What's that formula? How'd you
Yeah.
do it? How'd you do it?
I don't know if I can put it down in an
How'd you put your
arithmetic.
soul
Uh,
into each
yeah.
character?
Well, it's just time and just sitting with it and not rushing the process. I have a I did my film school degree at USC, but before I did the graduate film program there, I did undergraduate at Ohio State University. I was a journalism major.
Hmm,
And the thing I love about journalism is the research, right? There's so much research that you have to do before you go into an article, before you go do an interview on a subject, to really kind of give yourself a baseline understanding of the topic. And I think what's really been huge on this project, I mean, obviously it's a Western, there's research things you need to do as a period piece, type thing, but also doing research on the characters and the type of people that were around at that time, and also seeing what their wants and needs were, what the real life trials and tribulations of these people were, and then adapting that to a fictional level. I think I spent so much time doing the research that by the time I got to actually writing the characters,
hmm.
it just felt it was just a natural flow. And like I said, it's something you see big time in the feature version of this, because I had to go and it just took forever to find just information on the actual historical event, because there was not a lot of material about it. And eventually what I found was this little book. So the bookshelf behind me, it was brilliant. All it did was take it took all the newspaper articles from that time and just laid them out in chronological order. The book itself really gives you no bias or no subjectivity on the actual event. It just lays out all these actual newspaper articles. And so in the process of me reading the articles and reading the quotes from people at that time, I was able to put together a storyline and to build a world out of that. And then it was a matter of just plugging, these characters into that world of, craft, and help letting the story be crafted through them. And I just think it just felt so natural, because I put, you know, almost a year of research, into it. I just when you're really wanting to try something that's truthful and authentic and
Yeah,
true, you can't rush the research
yeah,
process.
yeah,
That
yeah,
part is huge. And also doing the right research,
yeah.
making sure you are looking at pieces, reading things that give you a wide and varied
Yeah,
view of
yeah,
things, and not just
yeah,
a singular source, but finding information that may conflict. I would actually love it when I would get a piece of information that didn't necessarily line up with a piece, because again, there's that idea of optics. It's like, oh, well, it's interesting, they reported it this way, they reported it this way. I'm
yeah,
sure if you were to
yeah.
bring both reporters to 2023, they would both see each other's pieces as being respectively correct. Again, it's that dissenting opinion, that dissenting vision.
That's
I think
great.
all that kind of played into saying, here's how we're going to craft these characters to be,
That's great.
truthful and authentic to the time.
That's great. And what I hear
Yeah.
you saying is
Thank
it's
you.
a, yeah, it really is, because you did your homework.
Yeah.
You did your homework, you
Yeah.
put in the time, you immersed yourself in the world, and you gathered a 360 holistic perspective. And then you just
Absolutely.
let it rip. Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah. Pretty much.
Yeah.
Pretty much. Yep.
Harry Locke IV, filmmaker, writer, director. The short is The Redeemer. The feature's coming out. It's a pleasure to have you on the show. Thank you so much for being here.
Thank you for having me. I appreciate it so much.
All right, everybody. Peace later. Happy, I don't know, Friday. Bye.